Okay, hey guys. So I posted a live video on Facebook, the Betterton Bullfrog Facebook, but it didn't let me save because it was too long. So I'm going to re-record and read these three chapters. So again, we are reading Blizzard of the Blue Moon, book number 8 of the Merlin missions. And this is chapter 3 called Lost in Central Park. Jack and Annie kept walking until they came to the ice pond again. "We've been here before," said Jack. "We're going in circles. How do we get out of the park?" "We have to try to walk in a straight line," said Annie. Annie and Jack struggled on. Jack kept looking back, trying to catch sight of Teddy and Kathleen again, but it was getting harder and harder to see anything. Wet snow kept sticking to his glasses. Snow had blown up his sleeve of his jacket, under his neck scarf, and into his mittens. "Yikes," said Annie. She grabbed Jack's arm. "Look!" A huge wolf-like dog stood on a ledge above them, his mouth open. "Whoa," said Jack. The dog didn't move. He stood perfectly still. Here's a picture. Annie laughed. "Oh, he's a statue," she said. She ran to a plaque under the dog statue, brushed off the snow, and shouted to Jack. "His name is Balto." In 1925, he carried medicine 600 miles through a blizzard in Alaska. "That's really great," said Jack. "But how do we get out of the park?" "Well, if we follow this path, it's bound to lead somewhere," said Annie. Jack followed Annie up a wide path. They walked and walked, passing a snow-covered outdoor stage and a fountain with the statue of an angel. Raising her outspread wings, the angel seemed about to fly away. "Which way now?" said Jack. 2 paths led away from the angel fountain, one to the right and one to the left. "I don't know," said Annie. "Pick one." Jack headed to the left. Annie followed. They passed a frozen lake and walked over an arched bridge. Jack kept his eyes on the ground and walked and walked and walked. Every time he lifted his head, the snow felt like needles against his skin. Jack tried to keep walking in a straight line, but the path they were following began twisting and turning like a maze. Different paths branched off, curving this way and that. Jack remembered information from the research book. The park has 32 miles of winding footpaths. "We have got to get off these paths," he shouted to Annie, "or we'll be lost in Central Park forever." Annie didn't answer. "Annie!" Jack shielded his face from the cutting wind and looked back. He didn't see her. Jack turned around and around, looking for Annie, but he couldn't see anything. The world was completely white. "Annie!" he cried. Had she gone off on another path? Was she lost? Annie! She couldn't wander around in the storm for hours. Or she could. She could wander around in the storm for hours, thought Jack. She could freeze to death. "I have to find her." Jack tried to stay calm. He took a few breaths. A rhyme, he thought. He couldn't remember which magic rhymes were left. He struggled to unbuckle his briefcase. His fingers felt frozen. He pulled out the book and hunched over it, trying to shelter it from the storm. He wiped his glasses off and read, "Turn into ducks." That wouldn't help. "Pull a cloud from the sky." That would only make things worse. "Find a treasure you must never lose." Is Annie a treasure? Jack wondered. He'd always thought of a treasure as something super valuable, like gold or silver or rare jewels. But right now, Annie seemed more valuable than any of those things. She seemed like the most valuable thing in the world. Jack found the rhyme and shouted, "Treasure forever, must never be lost. Motto cow, motto bust." "Jack!" Jack whirled around. Annie was standing right behind him. "There you are," she said. "I was afraid you got lost." "I wasn't lost," said Jack. "You were lost." He slipped the rhyme book back into his briefcase. "Not me, you," said Annie. "Whatever," said Jack. "Just stay near me now." He took her hand and gripped it tightly. "Okay, let's figure out what to do." "Wait, is that a castle over there?" said Annie. "A what?" said Jack. "A castle, look." Peering through the storm, Jack saw a small castle sitting on top of a snowy hill. A light burned in a window. A castle in Central Park? Jack said. That's weird. Let's go see if anyone's inside, said Annie. Maybe they can help us. People in a castle might know about unicorns, or at least know how to get out of the park, said Jack. There's the picture of the castle. So I'm assuming that's still there, since this is in real New York, even though it was a long time ago. Jack and Annie struggled up the stone steps that led to the castle. At the top of the steps, Jack glanced back at the park. He could barely make out two figures in the snow, one in a dark cape and one in a raincoat. Them! It's them! Said Jack. A cloud of wind-driven snow blew over the couple. Jack kept looking, eager for another glimpse of the two young enchanters, but the snow hid everything in sight. They'll find us, said Annie. Come on. She pushed open the door to the castle and led the way inside. The door slammed shut behind them. Jack and Annie stood in a dimly lit hallway. Hello? Who's there? A man called. Jack and Annie, shouted Annie. A tall, thin man came down a curving stone stairway. He wore an old-fashioned blue-striped suit. Goodness, 2 children? He said. What are you doing here on a day like today? Well, we got lost in the park, said Jack. My name's Jack, and this is my sister Annie. Pleased to meet you. I'm Bill Perkins, said the man. Oh, excuse me, I got a hair. Welcome to Belvedere Castle. What is this place? Asked Annie. The castle was built in 1869, said Mr. Perkins. It was meant to be a delightful surprise when one wandered the park. Today it's a delightful surprise with a nature observatory and weather instruments inside. Weather instruments? Said Jack. Yes, I've come from the U.S. Weather Bureau to check them, said Mr. Perkins. I'm afraid right now our data is telling us that the weather is undergoing a rapid and terrible change. Jack shivered in his damp clothes. Our data is telling us the same thing, he said. A storm has blown in from the Midwest, bringing wind and snow, said Mr. Perkins. But after nightfall, things will get worse. Another storm is coming up from the south, gathering speed on its way. That sounds serious, said Annie. It's worse than serious, Mr. Perkins said. It's disastrous. After dark, the two systems will meet and create a monster blizzard. It could be the worst in New York history, even worse than the blizzard of '88. Jack caught his breath. Poor New York, said Annie. Ah, yes, it's the last thing our great city needs during these hard times, said Mr. Perkins, shaking his head. Excuse me, but I have a question, said Annie. Do you know if there's a full moon tonight? Well, yes, there is, said Bill Perkins. You won't see it, though, not through those storm clouds. Actually, it'll be the second full moon this month. A blue moon? Said Annie. You're exactly right. A blue moon indeed, said Mr. Perkins. I have another question, said Annie. Do you know where we can find, any unusual animals? Jack interrupted. On public display somewhere in New York City? Well, your best bet in New York would be the Bronx Zoo, said Mr. Perkins. They display all kinds of animals from all over the world. Great, said Annie. How do we get there? What? You can't go to the zoo today, said Mr. Perkins. Not in this storm. No, of course not, Jack said quickly. But if we ever decide to go to the zoo in the future, how would we get there? Well, the best way would be to take the West Side IRT, said Mr. Perkins. What's that? Said Jack. A subway line that runs up the west side, said Mr. Perkins. The number 2 train on that line will take you to the Bronx Zoo. Oh, great. Thanks for everything, said Jack. We'd better get going now. He and Annie started toward the door. Wait, there's a telephone upstairs. Let me ring up your parents. Perhaps they can come get you, said Mr. Perkins. Well, said Annie, we haven't lived here very long, and we don't have a telephone yet. She's right, said Jack, but it's not far to where we live. We just need to get out of the park to the street. To the west side, said Annie. Yeah, the west side, said Jack. Can you tell us how to get there from here? Certainly, Mr. Perkins opened the door. Wind and snow blasted inside as he pointed to the right. Cross the terrace and then walk down the stairs to a path. That path will take you out of the park to 81st Street, he said. Hurry home now. We will, said Jack. Thanks a lot, Mr. Perkins, said Annie, and she and Jack headed back out into the blizzard. All right, so chapter 4 is called Hard Times. The wind lashed the bare trees and swept the snow into tall drifts. "That way," said Annie. She led the way down the castle steps to the path. "Mr. Perkins was a nice guy," said Annie as they headed toward the west side of the park. "Yeah," said Jack. "Someday I'd like to go back there and see all his weather instruments." Jack and Annie trudged through the storm until they saw buildings just beyond the trees. "We're almost out of Central Park," Annie said. Jack looked around. "Do you see Teddy and Kathleen?" he said. "No, but we'd better keep going if we want to get to the zoo today," said Annie. Jack agreed. Mr. Perkins had said that. The blizzard was going to turn into a monster after dark, and dark came early in November. They left the park and came to a wide city street. All sorts of things were blowing about in the wind. Newspapers, hats, and umbrellas turned inside out. Jack and Annie grabbed a lamp post and clung to it, trying to keep from getting blown away too. When there was a lull in the storm, they trudged across the avenue. It was lined with cars half buried in the snow. Jack and Annie started down a side street. They passed an old man and woman huddled in a doorway, wrapped in torn blankets, burning a fire in a small stove. They passed a line of men dressed in ragged clothes standing outside a building. A sign said, "Free soup." There's the free soup. All the people standing in line. Jack hoped everyone outside would find better shelter before the monster blizzard hit. "Excuse me," Annie called to the men in the line for free soup. "Do you know where the West Side IRT subway is?" "2 blocks, said a man. "Keep going." "Thanks," said Annie. Jack and Annie kept going. They passed a firehouse, a cheese store, and a newsstand. Everything was closed and shuttered. Peddlers' carts were stuck in drifts. Signs banged in the wind. One said, "Meatballs and beans, 10 cents. Another said, "Zito's Bakery, 5 cents a loaf." A third said, "Lodging, $2 a week." Jack and Annie crossed the street. They saw newsboys huddled under a theater awning. The boys had wrapped their feet and legs in newspapers to keep warm. "Excuse me, where's the subway?" Jack shouted. "End of the block and around the corner." "Green ball," said a boy. "Green ball?" wondered Jack. "What does that mean?" "Thanks," said Annie. "You guys should go home. After dark, the storm's turning into a monster." Jack and Annie trudged on. When they turned the corner, Annie shouted, "Look, a green ball!" On top of a post was a large green ball. The post was next to a stairway that led underground. A sign said, "Uptown IRT trains, 1, 2, 3. "That's it. Mr. Perkins said we take the number 2, said Annie. "Wait, do you see Teddy and Kathleen?" said Jack, peering through the snow. Annie looked with him down the city street. "I don't see them, but I'm sure they'll find us," said Annie. She and Jack started down the stairs that led underground. The stairway was filled with people trying to get out of the storm. Jack and Annie walked with the crowd into the subway station. A long line waited in front of a turnstile. A sign over the turnstile said, "Subway, 5 cents. "Oops, do you have any money for the subway?" Annie asked Jack. "Yeah, I think I left home with at least $1 in change," said Jack. He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 nickels. "Cool," said Annie. She led the way to the line. As they waited, Jack looked around the station. A banjo player played a silly tune, but no one smiled. A man in rags walked around holding out a hat, begging for money. Jack took another nickel from his pocket and dropped it into the hat. Thank you, bless you," said the beggar. "Sure," said Jack. As the beggar walked on, Jack looked at Annie. "Boy, just a little nickel made him so happy," he said. "I know everyone seems really poor and desperate here," said Annie. "I wonder why," said Jack. While the line moved slowly toward the turnstile, he pulled out the research book. He read aloud from the introduction. In the 1930s, New York City, New York City, as well as the rest of the United States, suffered through hard times known as the Great Depression. Jobs were scarce and many people had no money or homes. That's what Mr. Perkins was talking about, said Jack. Hard times. I wish we could help everyone, said Annie. Me too, said Jack. But right now our mission is to save a unicorn under a spell, said Annie. Jack frowned. Our mission sounds like a fairy tale from a make-believe world, he said, not the real world of the Great Depression. I know, said Annie. Hey, it's almost our turn. What do we do? Let's watch the person in front of us, said Jack. Jack and Annie watched an old woman put her nickel in the slot of the turnstile, which led to the train platform. The woman pushed through and joined the crowd of people waiting for the train. Jack and Annie put their nickels into the slot and pushed through too. The platform was bitterly cold. People looked worried, as if they feared the subway train might never come. Jack felt worried too, but mainly because their mission wasn't making any sense. They were trying to get to the zoo before the blue moon and before a monster blizzard hit the city. But when they got to the zoo, what then? This is what I don't understand, Jack said to Annie. The poem says the unicorn is on public display. But if that's true, why haven't we ever read about New York City once having a unicorn in a zoo? That would be major news. Yeah, but remember the poem says he's hidden well, and he's under a spell, said Annie. So maybe the spell makes him look like a regular animal. But when we get to the zoo and say his name, he'll come out of hiding and reveal his true nature, said Jack. Exactly, said Annie. Okay, said Jack, but how will we know what kind of animal to look for? A signal bell clanged. Lights appeared at the end of the tunnel. Jack and Annie moved with the crowd as it surged forward. The subway train rumbled down the tracks. On the side of the train, Jack saw a big number 2. That's us, he said. And here's a picture. I don't know if you've ever ridden on a subway, but it's really, really cool. When the train stopped, everyone on the platform crammed inside. Jack and Annie were squashed into one of the first cars. All the seats were taken, so they had to stand in the aisle. They held onto a silver pole as more riders squeezed into the subway car and grabbed straps hanging overhead. Jack actually didn't mind the tight squeeze. He was anxious to thaw out from the cold. Look, Jack, cried Annie. She pointed out a window of the subway car. Jack peered out the window just in time to see 2 people rush across the platform toward one of the rear cars. One was dressed in a dark cape, the other in a tan raincoat. A bell sounded. The subway doors closed and the train started down the tracks. Yay, they're on the train, exclaimed Annie. Cool, said Jack, grinning. We'll see them when we get off. Hey, where do we get off? Said Annie. Oh, man, we forgot to ask, said Jack. He turned to the lady next to them. Excuse me, where do we get off for the Bronx Zoo? He asked her. Tremont Avenue, the woman said gruffly. Where's that? Asked Annie. There's a map, said the woman. She pointed to a map on the wall above a row of seated passengers. Jack and Annie stared at all the colorful lines that showed the subway system. Nothing here makes sense, said Jack. Do you need help? The girl sitting under the map said. She wore a tattered purple shawl over her head and shoulders. Yes, please, said Annie. Could you tell us where we get off for the Bronx Zoo? It's much further north, said the girl. I'll let you know when we get to the right stop. Thanks, said Jack. The train bumped and creaked along. Stopping every couple of minutes, Jack looked out the window and tried to read the name of each station. But sometimes the platforms were too crowded. He was glad the girl in the shawl had promised to help them. Just when Jack was starting to feel warm and a little drowsy, the girl called out, Your stop's next. Thanks a lot, said Annie. She and Jack squeezed through the crowd toward the doors. When the train stopped and the doors opened, Jack and Annie were practically pushed out onto the platform with the other people leaving. The subway doors closed and the train moved on. All right, so chapter 5 is called The Cloisters, and that's such a weird word. We were trying to figure out, what does that mean? Cloisters. Do you see Teddy and Kathleen? Asked Jack. The crowd was swarming away from the subway platform toward different exits. Jack couldn't see anyone who looked like the 2 young enchanters. No, said Annie, but if we figured out where to get off, I'm sure they did too. Let's hurry and get to the zoo. We can meet up with them there." Jack and Annie moved with the crowd. They passed a change booth on the way out of the station. "Wait, I'll ask where to go," said Annie. She waited in line and then leaned forward to talk to the man in the booth. "Do you know how to walk to the Bronx Zoo from here?" she said. "Walk to the Bronx Zoo? Are you out of your mind?" said the man. "This isn't the stop for the Bronx Zoo. It's much further north." "You mean we got out at the wrong stop?" said Annie. "You did, but it doesn't matter," said the man. "You can't get there now anyway. The tracks near the zoo are above ground, and I just got word they're buried in snow." "Oh, no," said Jack. "Lousy day for the zoo anyway," said the man. "Next." Jack and Annie stepped away from the booth and walked out of the subway station. The sidewalk was deserted. "Oh, man, that girl gave us the wrong information," said Jack. "This is terrible," said Annie. "No kidding," said Jack. He looked around, wondering what to do next. "Auga! Auga!" "What's that?" said Jack. "It looks like a taxi." Annie pointed at a big yellow car with a checkerboard stripe and writing on the side. Its horn let out a loud squawk. "Auga! Auga!" The driver stuck his head out the window. He wore a big furry cap that came down over his ears. "Need a taxi?" he called. "Yes," shouted Annie. "Come on, Jack. He can take us to the zoo." Jack hurried after her through the snow. The taxi driver stepped out of the cab and opened the back door. "Hop in," he said. His cheerful voice was muffled through a plaid scarf that covered half of his face. "Thanks," said Jack. He stepped onto a running board and then climbed inside. The taxi was very roomy. Jack could stretch his legs out and not even touch the front seat. "Boy, lots more room in old cars than ours," he said to Annie. "Yeah," said Annie. "And there's no seat belts." "Oh, yeah," said Jack. "I guess old cars didn't have any. I hope this guy's a good driver." The driver slid open a little window that separated the front seat from the back. "Where to?" he asked. "Can you please take us to the Bronx Zoo?" said Annie. "We're in a big hurry to get there," said Jack. "Sure thing, kiddos," said the driver. "Great," said Jack. "Oh, how much will it cost?" asked Annie. "About 30 cents, said the driver. "Can you afford it?" "Sure thing, kiddo," said Annie. The driver laughed and closed the window. Then the taxi began moving through the snow. "Everything's so cheap here," Annie said to Jack. "To us it is," said Jack, "but it's the Great Depression. Lots of people didn't even have a nickel." The taxi slid over the icy road and bumped over the curb. "Whoa," said Jack, slipping off the seat. "Sorry, kiddos," called the driver. He got the taxi back onto the street. Then he plowed on through the snow, swerving this way and that. The ride seemed dangerous in the bad weather, but Jack didn't want to get out now. He stared nervously out the window. The streets were empty of people. All the stores were closed and shuttered. Snow was piling up on apartment stoops, fire escapes, and iron balconies. Many of the buildings were shabby and crumbling, with broken windows. "Hard times," Annie said softly. "Yep," said Jack. He took a deep breath. The taxi climbed up a road lined with tall evergreen trees. Suddenly it skidded and came to a stop. The engine roared, but the taxi's wheels only spun in the snow. "What's happening?" Jack wondered aloud. He tapped on the glass that separated them from the driver. The driver slid the window open. "Too bad, kiddos. Looks like I'm stuck," he said. "Are we near the zoo?" asked Annie. "It's still a long ways from here, I'm sorry to say," said the driver. "But this taxi's not going anywhere. I don't know what else to tell you." "Oh, well, thanks," said Annie. "How much do we owe you?" "Forget it, kiddo," said the driver. "Good luck." "Good luck yourself, kiddo," said Annie. She opened the door, and she and Jack climbed out into the cold wind. The taxi motor kept running, but the wheels only spun in place, sending up sprays of dirty snow. "I don't believe this," said Jack. "Maybe there's a subway station somewhere near here," said Annie. "The man in the booth said the subways aren't running all the way to the zoo," said Jack. "I know, but maybe we can at least get closer," said Annie. Jack and Annie struggled through the storm until they came to a steep cliff. Over the edge of the cliff, they saw nothing but a cloud of wind-blown snow. "Where are we?" said Annie. "I have no idea," said Jack, his teeth chattering. His eyes and ears stung with the cold, and his hands and feet felt numb. Isn't this what frostbite feels like? He thought. Numb? Let's go back and sit in the taxi until we figure out what to do, said Jack. At least get out of the wind. Okay, said Annie. Maybe the driver will get it going again. Jack and Annie headed back the way they'd come, but the taxi was gone. Hey, he must have gotten it unstuck, said Annie, and he left us. Oh, man, said Jack. We're having a really rotten luck, and I think I'm starting to get frostbite. Seriously. It looks like there's a building over there, said Annie. I see a tower. Yeah, me too, said Jack. Let's go there and try to figure out what to do next. Jack and Annie trekked up to what looked like a long driveway until they came to the gray stone building. Jack wiped snow from a sign in front. Cloisters of the Metropolitan Museum open to the public. A museum? Said Annie. Let's go in and ask them how to get to the zoo. Yeah, and get warm for a minute, said Jack. He and Annie climbed the snow-covered steps of the cloisters. Annie opened the door, and the wind nearly swept them inside. They pushed the door shut. Ah, my first visitors all day, a woman chirped. Jack and Annie turned around. A museum lady sat at a desk in the corner. Dressed in a green uniform, she was tall and thin, with a friendly face and short gray hair. I'm sorry, but we can't stay long, said Annie. We just came here to get warm for a minute and get some information. What can I tell you? The woman asked. We're trying to get to the Bronx Zoo, said Jack. Is there a subway near here? Well, the A train is close by, said the museum lady, but that won't take you anywhere near the zoo. Oh, darn, said Annie. Oh, I wouldn't be so sad, the woman said brightly. If I were you, I'd stay right here and enjoy the cloisters. You won't regret it, I promise. The cloisters holds most of the medieval collection of the world-famous Metropolitan Museum of Art. What's a cloister? Annie asked. It's an enclosed garden or courtyard, said the museum lady. We have 4 in all. They beautifully evoked medieval times, from the Romanesque period to the light, airy elegance of the Gothic. Cool, said Jack politely. He had no idea what she was talking about. I suppose the gardens are cool most days, my dear, said the woman, but today they are freezing. Never mind. You won't have to spend time in the gardens to enjoy the museum. Inside, we have many beautiful exhibits. The tapestries are especially lovely. They were woven with beautiful yarns by weavers from the Netherlands. For years, they hung in a French castle and managed to escape destruction during the Revolution. Then, for 2 generations... Excuse me, said Jack. He was eager to end the woman's boring lecture so they could be on their way. But she kept talking excitedly. The tapestries were used by peasants to protect potatoes stored in their barns until eventually a countess rescued them. They were restored, and in 1922, Mr. John D. Rockefeller Jr. bought them. Just last year, Mr. Rockefeller gave them as gifts to... Oh, that is so cool, interrupted Jack loudly. He pretended to be interested so they could escape. We'd love to see them. Where are they? The tapestry room is just on the other side of the first cloister, the woman said, pointing. Turn that corner, go out the door, and then walk through the garden to the door of the tapestry room. Let's go, Annie, quick, said Jack. He and Annie went around the corner, out the door, and into a snowy garden. Whew, said Jack. I didn't want to be rude, but we were short on time. I know, said Annie. Well, what now? Said Jack, shivering in the cold. We need to figure out exactly where we are, said Annie, and where the Bronx Zoo is. Maybe we can just walk there from here. Come on, let's get inside the tapestry room and check our research book for a map, said Jack. They walked along the edge of the garden under a covered walkway. When they came to a door, Jack pushed it open, and he and Annie slipped out of the cold into a large, warm room. Jack closed the door against the storm and unbuckled his briefcase to take out their research books. Oh, wow, breathed Annie. What? Said Jack. He looked up. The walls of the room were covered with cloth hangings, tapestries shimmering with gold and silver. Oh, whispered Jack, a unicorn. Here's the picture of them walking to where they need to go. All right. Well, that is all for today. So chapter 6 is called The Hunt of the Unicorn. And that will be what I read tomorrow. Now, I'm going to read 3 chapters tomorrow also. And then finish up probably earlier on Friday reading the last 2 chapters. So if you're following along, just be ready to read chapter 6, 7, and 8 tomorrow. All right. Thanks for joining me. Talk to you later. Bye.